So the Symposium's opening lecture, Spain in the American Revolution, will be delivered tonight by historian Gonzalo Quintero Saravia. You all have complete biographies of the scholars who will present their work in the program. I will read a brief version. Gonzalo Quintero Saravia holds doctorates both in history of the Americas from the Complutense University of Madrid and in public law from the UNED, Spain's National Distance Learning University. He's a corresponding member of the Spanish Royal Academy of History and the Colombian Academy of History. His book, Bernardo de Galvez, Spanish Hero of the American Revolution, received the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book Award for Best Biography in 2018. His latest book, The Enemy of My Enemy, Spain in the American War of Independence, will appear in Spanish next week and hopefully in English next year. Mr. Quintero will take your questions at the Q&A period following the end of the first session. In order to ensure a smooth Q&A, we ask that you submit your questions through the QR code in the screen and the signs in the auditorium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your Majesty, Señora, Your Excellency, Doña Ángeles Moreno, Ambassador of Spain, Mrs. Jeannie Sebastian Storage, President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution, Doña Pilar Lladó, Chair of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, Raimundo Pérez Hernández, ladies and gentlemen. What a sight in this wonderful Constitution Hall, filled with so many people, and what a pressure to be at the same stage that 21 years ago, Frank Sinatra filled. I hope this afternoon luck will be a lady to me tonight too. And what a responsibility to be here addressing you after Bernardo de Galvez, whom I've been reading in dusty archives for at least 10 years for the biography I wrote on him. What a responsibility. Hope it works. As Benjamin Franklin wrote when he was negotiating the 1883 treaties in Paris, though we are yet under no obligations to Spain by treaty, we are under obligations of gratitude for the assistance she has afforded us. But we must remember, as George Washington stated, that the assistance the Spanish provided was done under the circumstances of how nations operate in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th, and in the 21st one, following their own national interests. As George Washington said to Diego de Gardoqui, the first Spanish ambassador to the US, your wish to establish a permanent and sincere amity between these states and the court of Spain is highly meritorious. And if, as you observe, no two nations apply more exactly to each other, a connection between them upon the basis of reciprocal interest must be a very desirable event. Before starting on the subject, let's see the situation in the Americas in the late 18th century. Elijah Gould has asked us to change our views and consider the British Atlantic as the periphery of the Spanish Atlantic in the 18th century. First of all, the cities in the Americas in 75. As you can see, the cities in North America were much smaller than the cities in Spanish America. Not only that, but Mexico City, with a population of over 200,000 people at the time, was the largest city in the Spanish Empire, which speaks volumes about the Spanish Empire, how it was organized. We can never imagine a French Empire with a city larger than Paris. We can never imagine a British Empire with a city larger than London. But in the Spanish Empire, the largest city was Mexico, not the capital. Secondly, the GDP in the Americas in 75. While the viceroyalty in Peru was not rich enough compared with the 13 colonies, the GDP in New Spain, which is today most of the southern states of the US, the whole nation of Mexico, and Central America, almost doubled the GDP, far richer than it was. and considered cultural universities. While in the British colonies in 75, there were 9 universities, and actually most of them weren't actually considered universities because there were theological studies. In Spain, in the Spanish Empire, at that time, there were already 27. But the origin of everything is the French and Indian War, as you call it here, or the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, for Britain, it was the beginning of a failed empire reform. They had to pay for all the cost of the war, and they decided that it was a good idea to tax the colonies. Bad idea at the end. But not only that, the 13 colonies were stopped in their expansion to the west by the Proclamation Line of 63, which meant that the 13 colonies could not expand to the lands they considered their rightful own, and they were reserved for the Native Americans, which created another problem. Other British colonies were also in the Americas. Only 13 rebelled, but there were 20-something colonies in the Americas at the time. And most important, not only in Canada, but also East and West Florida, and also lots of them in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, to which we will return later on. For France, it meant disappearing from North America and the loss of international status. For Spain, it began the successful empire reform put forward by the civil servants under the rule of Charles III. Also, it meant the loss of Florida. The problem with that was the menace from Florida to Cuba, the pearl of the Antilles for the Spanish Empire. And reluctantly had to incorporate Louisiana. As Begoña said before, Spain didn't want Louisiana because it was a very poor populated area. But there was a choice. Either you have it, or either the Brits will do it. And if the Brits move towards Louisiana, they will be too close for comfort towards the rich viceroyalty of New Spain, that means Mexico. This is the coat of arms of Spanish Louisiana. As you see, the upper part is the coat of arms of Spain, the lion and the castle, and the lower part is the Father Mississippi. But again, to understand the Spanish model of colonization, not only the richness of the Mexico, but also how the Spanish govern their local native population. France had Louisiana for 80 years. Spain had Louisiana for 40. During that period of time, there were 11 governors from French origin and 11 governors from Spanish origin. None of the French ones married a local. Of the 11, 6 married a local, which speaks volumes about how the Spanish behave when they're abroad. And this is probably the most important couple in Louisiana, the power couple of Louisiana. Bernardo de Galvez, who just met, who married Felicitas Saint-Marchand, a local from Louisiana that I think she deserves more credit than she's been given. So bear with me, lend me your ears, and I would like to speak just a few minutes about this very extremely important woman. She was born in New Orleans in 55. And before her 22nd birthday, she married the son of a former French treasurer. And shortly after, she had a daughter. While the death of her husband at the age of 25 left her a young widow, her destiny was to be affected by events on the other side of the world. The transfer of Louisiana to France from France to Spain would not be quick or easy. The new Spanish governor did not arrive in New Orleans until March 1766 to take possession of what the Spanish government considered a poisonous gift from the French. 2 years later, the former French subjects rebelled against their new Spanish masters, and this rebellion was swiftly suppressed with the support of part of the Louisiana population, among whom Feliciana's father, Gilberto Saint-Marchand, played a very significant role. On November 2nd, 77, Feliciana married Bernardo de Galvez, the young governor who came from Spain, who in January that year was named full governor. They married in articulo mortis. That is while Bernardo de Galvez was seriously ill, and fearing his imminent death, that allowed him to circumvent several law provisions that forbade any Spanish official to marry within his jurisdiction. Keeping such a secret in New Orleans could not have been easy, but it certainly became almost impossible in the August of the following year. On the 13th of that month, almost exactly 9 months after the marriage, their daughter Matilda was born. So either Bernardo de Galvez's illness was not so serious, or his marriage to Feliciana performed the miracle of his speedy recovery. In any case, from the very beginning, Felicitas had to endure the opposition of her husband's family because they considered that although she was a member of one of the richest families in Louisiana, Louisiana was nothing in comparison with other parts of the Spanish Empire. From the moment of their marriage, the only time the couple of Bernardo and Feliciana were separated was when Bernardo was commanding Spanish troops. But even then, sometimes they managed to be together. Such was the case in 1782, when Allied troops were concentrating in Guarico, today's Haiti, for a final assault against Jamaica. Instead of comfortably waiting in New Orleans to have the baby, Felicitas arrived amidst the military camp and delivered the baby there, Miguel, the first baby boy of the couple. When Bernardo de Galvez was later on appointed Viceroy of New Spain, that means Mexico, the couple continued to defy social conventions and norms by taking long walks around Mexico City or by sleeping together in the same bed, which was at the time was considered unheard of and improper by the extremely traditional upper classes, both in Spain and Mexico. Nevertheless, their kind nature and good humor, and most importantly, their commitment to helping the victims of a great famine that devastated Mexico made them extremely popular. After the death of Bernardo de Galvez in 1786, Felicitas went to Madrid, where her residence became the center of a popular and prestigious French-style political salon, where she brought together some of the best minds of the time. Feliciana's popularity would not last long, since the political environment was quickly changing. The Spanish government that had embraced the Enlightenment became horrified by its offspring, the French Revolution. In June 1790, all foreigners were deported from Madrid, and although Feliciana was legally Spaniard by marriage, in September she was ordered to leave the capital. Feliciana suspected the accusations against her originated with the Countess of Sonora, the widow of José de Galvez, the uncle of Bernardo. After much pleading, she was allowed to return to Madrid and was finally acquitted. Felicitas Saint-Martin de Galvez died in Aranjuez the 21st of May, 1799. Now returning to our subject. The Spain interest in the American Revolution, the main interest, both of France and Spain, was to weaken Great Britain. In the words of Felipe Fernández Armesto and Manuel Lucena Giraldo, when the European rivals began their own expansion in the Americas, they could do nothing but pick around the possessions of one already by the Spaniards. Therefore, since the 16th century, England would be the main challenger of Spain, of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and will continue to be so during the 18th century. But supporting the enemy problems in their own territory is an old tradition among empires. When your enemy is having problems, the best way to act is to foment those problems. And Spain had done so every single time. Here, you have the Royal College of St. Patrick's of Irish nobles. Also, you have the Royal College of St. Alban, or de los Ingleses, and the Royal Scots College of de los Escoceses. All of them founded to train priests from Scotland, England, or Ireland to return to their respective territories to create little problems for the British. Financial and material support of Spain. On February 75, months before the shot heard around the world was fired in Lexington and Concord, the Spanish firm Gardoque Hijos from Bilbao wrote to Jeremiah Lee, one of the wealthiest merchants in Massachusetts, about his efforts to procure him, and I quote, 300 muskets with the bayonets and about twice as many pairs of pistols. This is Diego de Gardoque. I will not insist of him. He was the first ambassador to the United States, Spanish ambassador to the United States. Actually, one was ambassador. He was military plenipotentiary. At the time, only monarchies were allowed to have a high-ranking representative called ambassador. If you were a republic, sorry, you were of a lesser level, and you were not awarded an ambassador, but a minister plenipotentiary, which is exactly the same, because the key word is not minister or ambassador, but plenipotentiary. That means he can do anything concerning the country. And that's Diego de Gardoque. I will not extend myself about this key figure, because tomorrow we will have the privilege of hearing Dr. Elisa Vargas talking about him. But this is very important because during the first part of the Spanish support to the American Revolution, they were channeled through this Spanish firm. Powder, ammunition, cannons, blankets, rifles, and money, lots of money, both as grants and loans. The impact of the Spanish money and the Spanish loan and the Spanish grants goes well beyond what happened and the delivery of the cash. Here we have a banknote issued by the Virginia Treasury in May 6, 1776, showing that the 5 Spanish mil dollars was the value of that paper money. And you see over there, that's the coat of arms of Spain. That's Virginia, but the Continental Congress did exactly almost the same. So there you have the bill that entitles the bearer to receive 4 Spanish mil dollars. But also it goes beyond, because in May 1840, a bank in the United States was making a publicity about several investments using the image of a Spanish peso mint in Mexico. That meant that the weight and the prestige of the Spanish money was a thing to be desired by the new continental currency. And that brings us, as you all know now, the next thing would be talking about the dollar, talking about the symbol of the peso, and talking about the symbol of the dollar, which are actually one come from the other. But here there are eminent experts in monetary questions, so I would not go further with this. The next thing was gathering information, espionage. Spain had been deploying a network of spies in British North America well before 75. Especially relevant was the network built in the Floridas after 1763, after the Floridas was lost in 1763. There, the Eligio de la Puente family from Cuba, with strong ties in Florida, played a crucial role. The involvement of Cuba would be essential for the United States independence, not only in gathering information, but also in supplying arms, ammunition, military materiel to the Continental Army of George Washington, and even with military units, like the African-American mulatto that fought under Bernardo de Galvez in his campaigns along the Mississippi in Mobile and Pensacola. And the new Indian policy that Spain started to apply to the Louisiana and the North America. The role of the indigenous people in the Spanish contribution to American independence would be the subject of tomorrow's dissertation by Professor Catherine Duval, that will be complemented with one by Professor Jane Landers on Afro-Americans. But here it's important to point out that the peculiarities of Louisiana required the design and implementation of a new policy for relations with the various and distinct indigenous groups that inhabited it. Among its instruments were the signing of agreements and treaties and the awarding of medals, a symbol of loyalties to the Spanish crown. Perhaps the most perfect example of this new system is the diploma certifying the awarding of the Grand Medal to Opoye Domingo by the governor of Louisiana, Baron de Carondelet. And I'm 61 years old or more or less, but I'm learning to use the AI. Preparing for war. The Count of Floridablanca wrote that Spain should prepare for war as if it was inevitable, but to do everything possible to avoid it. For this, he was called the delayer. But in 1776, from July 1776, something happened here in July in 76, I believe, no? And onwards, the policy had to change. The first was the Declaration of Independence. But take into account that this is not the beginning of the United States of a country. There are 13 countries. The U in United States is not capital. It's a lower case. And that means that the Declaration of Independence was made for 13 different separate entities that will become one until the Constitution several years later on. So actually the birth of the United States should not be 76, but a little bit after that. And this is key to understand the Spanish participation and the French participation in the American Revolution. Also, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation state that no state shall lay any imports of duties which may interfere with any stipulations in treaties entered by the United, again, no capital U, states in plural, in Congress assembled, with any king, prince of state, in pursuance of any treaties already proposed by Congress to the courts of France and Spain. That means the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, were a cry for help from the 13 colonies to France and Spain. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point that showed both France and Spain that the US was a serious contender, that maybe they could not win the war against Britain alone, but they could certainly put a brave face against her. The Count of Aranda wrote to the Marquis de Grimaldi in 77, obtaining a favorable treaty from the United Provinces, that is the United States, will depend on getting them out of their predicament and taking advantage of this opportunity to come to an agreement to them. So now we move what happened between June 79 and September 1783. France was incapable of winning the war by herself supporting the Americans. The first military and naval operations with the Continental Army and with the French forces ended up in a relatively bad position. So France incremented its pressure on Spain for getting her into the war. That's the Count of Vergennes. That's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France at the time. And I know the quote is a little bit long, but I think it's really interesting because it explains lots of things of the mindset of this 18th century regarding the views from Europe towards the 13 colonies at the time. There's the reflections of the current situation of the English colonies and the conduct that is best for France, written by the Count of Vergennes in 1775. And I quote, "But they can tell us that the independence of the English colonies would prepare a revolution in the New World, because as soon as they are calm and secure in their freedom, they will be swept away by a spirit of conquest that would result in the disappearance of our colonies and the rich possessions of the Spaniards in South America. But it seems to me," writes Vergennes, "that these two considerations may reassure those who have this fear. First, the war currently being waged by the colonies will tire and exhaust them, too much for them to dream of soon taking up arms to attack their neighbors. And second, it is entirely to be expected that if the colonies achieve their objectives, they will give their new government a republican form. And it is known from experience that republics rarely have a spirit of conquest, and those that are formed in America would have it even less. And it is assumed that each province will form a separate republic, and that among all of them, they will barely make up a political confederation. and that these will know the pleasures and advantages of commerce, and that they will need not to foster the industry as a consequence of peace, procure the comforts of life in the same quantity as the basic necessities. So there was no problem in having a republic. Spain had to make a choice what was preferably for her in North America, to have as a neighbor the British Empire with all its might and naval might, or 13 separate, weak republics. How wrong they were, we know, but we know that now. They didn't know it at the time. Spain's choice of a neighbor, the British Empire or the American Republic. Spain's objectives that were imposed over the French was to retake Gibraltar, Mobile, Pensacola, expelling Britain from Honduras, revoking British access to the Palo de Tinte, and gaining again Minorca. Then they signed the pact, and then Spain declared war in June 1979 to Great Britain. What were the consequences of this entry of Spain in the war? First was a huge Allied numerical superiority. In 1778, ships of the line, 117, the Brits, the Royal Navy, and the French, 79, more or less. Larry Ferreiro will correct all these figures, of course. And in 79, the balance of power had completely shifted. But not only at sea, but also the troops fighting in North America. In the Battle of Pensacola, there were 1,200 British troops and 7,303 Spanish troops and 182 French ones. In Yorktown, 8,000 Brits, 9,000 Americans, and almost 8,000 Frenchmen. That means that the Allies are taking now the initiative, that Britain is on the defensive, and Britain is facing an increasing international isolation. Spain imposes her own priorities on war, and it transforms into a global war. The American theater was only one of the theaters of the American Revolution. The American Revolution was fought not only in what is today the United States, but also in the Caribbean, in Central America, in Africa, in the Atlantic, in the English coast, in the Mediterranean, in the north of Africa, in the south of Africa, in India, and in the Indian Ocean. So it's a global conflict. And this is the theaters of operations in which Spain intervened directly. First was the attempted invasion of England in 1979, from June to September. The Spanish government convinced the French one that it was a good idea to invade Britain for a short period of time to provoke a panic in their economy, in the stock exchange, to force the British government to sue quickly for peace. At the end, it never happened, of course. If it happened, we will know about it. North America, between 79 and 81, the first were the campaigns of Bernardo de Galvez along the Mississippi, conquering in Manchac and Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola. Then, Gibraltar. Yorktown is not the biggest battle of the American Revolution. By far, the biggest battle of the American Revolution is Gibraltar. No comparison in number of troops, ships, men, or casualties. We tend to think of Yorktown, but actually, the biggest one by far is Gibraltar. And also, the last battle of the American Revolution was the Spanish conquest of New Providence in the Caribbean, so in which there were no American troops involved. Central America, between 79 and 82, and a campaign that was carried out by Matias de Galvez, the father of Bernardo de Galvez, who was posted there, and in which Captain Horatio Nelson fought. He was seriously wounded, and according to one of Nelson's biographers, the more than 2,500 casualties suffered by the British made the San Juan expedition the costliest British disaster in the entire war of the American independence. But also, there was a great deal of fighting in the Atlantic. The Spanish admiral, Luis de Cordova, captured two American-bound British convoys. The first one in 1780, the second one 1 year later. But also Minorca. Minorca was attacked, sieged, and conquered by the combined Franco-Spanish forces in 1782. And of course, the Caribbean, that saw lots of actions during the whole war. That means that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Remember what said Benjamin Franklin at the beginning, that Spain and the US were not bound by the treaty, but the debts of gratitude? Because they were not allies at the war, but they share a common enemy, and they profit from that. The end of the war. From Britain, it meant the transition from the first to the second British Empire. One of the main causes of the fall of the first British Empire, that means the American Revolution and the American independence, is that these rebellious colonies thought that they were Englishmen and they were reclaiming their rights. So, after that example and the defeat of the British in this War of American Independence, the British government decided never to make the same mistake again and never would allow their colonies to believe that they were Englishmen with the same rights. Also, to the United States, of course, it gained independence, but we must remember that the independence gained in 1783 was an independence for 13 separate colonies. They would not become one country until the Constitution. It was a not easy road towards becoming a nation. As Vergennes pointed out in 75, the foreseeable future of the independent 13 colonies was not to form a single country. And it would take a tremendous effort from a group of committed patriots to give birth to the United States of America. In fact, the new republic will not be completely established until the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, and in operation a year later with the inauguration of George Washington as its first president in April the 30th. For France, it meant regaining her international status, but with the cost of a serious financial crisis. Now, it's not the crisis, in order to pay the cost of the war, is not considered now anymore as the direct consequence of the bankruptcy that took down the monarchy, but it was certainly a main factor. But for Spain, she attained almost all her major objectives, except Gibraltar. There was a favorable, extremely favorable economic situation. The cost of the war was borne by the royal treasury without affecting either the economy or public credit. The debt of Spain was only 5.3% of her GDP, while France's public debt for the war was 56% of the GDP, and Great Britain's 182% of the GDP. And also for Spain, it meant the Senate, the biggest territorial expansion, maybe too much. This is a map published after the Peace of Treaties of 1783, published in London in around 1790. In green are the Spanish possessions in North America. In more or less white, the United States of America. As you can see there, 2/3 of the United States continental territory was under the sovereignty of the King of Spain. But to be honest, that was not really true. All maps lie, because a zone of the map is colored in a color doesn't mean anything. The real persons who had hold the power in most of all these territories claimed by Spain were the Native Americans, who were signing treaties with the Spanish crown, as you had seen before with my marvelous AI, and those were the actual relevant actors in these parts of the country, as Professor Duval will show you later. And that's it. Thank you very much. That's very much.
Our first session tonight will present the general picture. Professor Gabriel Paquette's presentation will address the world in 1776, and Professor Manuel Lucena Giraldo will describe the Spanish Empire in the long 18th century. Professor Gabriel Paquette is professor of history at the University of Maine, where until recently he served as senior associate provost. He previously held teaching, research, and administrative leadership positions at the University of Oregon and the Johns Hopkins University. His books include The European Seaborne Empires, Imperial Portugal in the Age of Atlantic Revolutions, and Enlightenment, Governance, and Reform in Spain and its Empire. Professor Manuel Lucena Giraldo is research scientist in the Spanish Council for Scientific Research. He was a visiting scholar at Harvard University, lecturer being Overseas Studies program in Stanford University, and visiting professor at Gothenburg University, Tufts University, Javeriana University in Colombia, Colegio de Mexico, and University of the Andes. He's a member of Spain's Royal Academy of History and the Colombian Academy of History, as well as the European Academy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paquette.
It's truly a great honor to be here. Thank you for the warm introduction. It's a great honor to speak in front of Your Majesty, and it's a great honor to speak in front of the Daughters of the American Revolution, an organization that I've long admired. And so to actually speak here in Constitution Hall is a special privilege. We know that the revolution that took place 250 years ago on these shores was only partly an American one. It was, as Gonzalo has shared, a global phenomenon in which international actors played decisive roles. It was also, by definition, a hemispheric struggle. And in this hemisphere, Spain's empire was the most important feature. Such a remark would have been uncontroversial in the 18th century. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson observed, "Our connection with Spain is already important and will daily become more so. Besides, this ancient part of American history is chiefly written in Spanish." So, British North America on the eve of the Revolution was not at the center of the Americas. The extent of territory and population, the number and complexity of its settlements, the prestige and ubiquity of its universities, the wealth and opulence of its cities, such as Havana, Lima, Mexico City, far outstripped Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, according to multiple metrics, sheer size, per capita GDP, and so forth. Philadelphia, the largest city in the 13 colonies, had a population of 1/5 the size of Mexico City. So in trying to understand the world in 1776, we are advised to imagine a world in which demographically, culturally, and economically, Spain's colonies shone more brightly than those of Britain, from which this nation emerged. If not quite a backwater, Britain's colonies certainly were far from the center of the action. And these facts have implications for how we conceive of the conflict among rival empires that gave rise to the United States. Recasting the American Revolution as the founding of the nation in the 19th century paradoxically served to provincialize it, largely stripping it of its international dimension. So among our tasks this afternoon and tomorrow is to remind Americans of the significance of their story for others and the indispensable role of others in their story. The United States, then, is a nation born in the crucible of revolution, to be sure, but the revolution itself emerged from the crucible of war among empires that competed for dominion across the globe. Undoubtedly, it is defensible to portray the American Revolution as the opening salvo and a much emulated example in an age of revolutions and anti-colonial struggle lasting until the 20th century. But I would dispute such an orthodox approach, and I'd prefer a depiction of the American founding as a beneficiary of, even a side effect of a long struggle among European empires for dominance. In the eyes of most statesmen in Madrid and Paris, American independence was an unfortunate yet tolerable anomaly in a world of empires. So I've been invited to provide a snapshot of the world in 1776, and I will interpret my brief rather narrowly, conveniently for me, ignoring the massive land-based empires of Eurasia, including the Russian, the Qing, the Mughal, and Ottoman empires, and I will focus instead on the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world was not self-enclosed and impermeable. It was, however, remarkable for the intensity, degree, and duration of the interconnections that it both contained and facilitated across terrestrial and maritime space. The Atlantic world in 1776 was one in which 5 European empires, Spanish, British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese, jostled for primacy with far-reaching consequences for indigenous populations in the Americas, to say nothing of the states and societies of Africa. Viewed against this backdrop, many of the familiar features of the American Revolution take on fresh significance. For example, we often think of the French alliance with the rebellious colonists when we pause to consider the revolution's international dimension. And the reasons for this, of course, are valid. The formal support offered by the French government facilitated the creation of a new state in the bowels of the British Empire. But what happens when we view this support as merely the latest example in a half-century of similar efforts by France and Spain to undermine British imperial expansion in Europe, Asia, and the Americas? When we take that imaginative leap, the revolution becomes a key episode in the triumph of the Franco-Spanish alliance that was formalized in the second decade of the 18th century, when Benjamin Franklin was only 7 years old, and it was 19 years prior to George Washington's birth. So when we look, for example, as Gonzalo shared, at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, and we think about the French Navy's famous contribution to preventing Lord Cornwallis from receiving aid and reinforcement by sea, we have to remember that this French presence was only possible because of France and Spain having reached an agreement whereby the Spanish Navy would protect French colonies and shipping so that the French fleet could sail north and concentrate its forces on the eastern seaboard of what became the United States. So among other things, an emphasis on the imperial and international dimension should serve to explain why it took so long to finalize the peace, which wouldn't come until 1783. And part of the delay, as Gonzalo has already shared with you, was due to the Spanish Navy's ultimately failed siege of Gibraltar, which was and remains a British possession. Half a world away, in Central America, Spanish naval patrols rooted out British interlopers. But before the peace was finalized in 1783, Spain had sought in vain to extirpate these contraband traders from the Caribbean. But these two campaigns in Gibraltar and Central America helped to explain the slowness of resolving the conflict, quite apart from Britain's intransigence. These distant theaters of war, I would argue, were part of the American Revolution broadly understood. Or rather, the revolution cannot be understood without reference to these distant theaters, as the founders themselves were painfully aware. When we dare to open the aperture still wider, we perceive how imperial strategy itself impinged upon and was shaped by the outcome of the revolution. Britain struggled to balance commitments that were increasingly dispersed across Asia and North America. In 1780, of the 100,000 land forces under British command, a mere 30,000 of those were deployed in North America due to the geographical scope of the war, extending as it did from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Even though the peace of 1783 did irreparable damage to British prestige, Britain retained half of its colonies in North America, if the Caribbean islands are included. And many in Britain saw these as much more valuable than the mainland colonies that were lost. So while those colonies that coalesced into the United States were undoubtedly of rising importance on the eve of the American Revolution, British priorities themselves were shifting. The East India Company was engaged in a rapid territorial expansion in South Asia in the wake of the 1757 victory at the Battle of Plassey. Captain Cook's voyages in the Pacific in the late 1760s and 70s marked the end of the Pacific Ocean's status as a so-called Spanish lake, opening up a new arena of imperial competition. The outcome of the American Revolution therefore hastened Britain's swing to the east. It also encouraged, simultaneously, a new orientation to the north, where what had been until the early 1760s New France became, with the influx of loyalists fleeing the 13 now independent colonies, in increasingly flourishing Canada. So I hope these preliminary remarks serve to contextualize the American Revolution in the larger imperial struggle for geopolitical primacy. Now I'd like to turn to another context, to the period preceding the Revolution, to explain why the American Revolution proved important to those throughout the Atlantic world. In the century preceding 1776, Britain was an increasingly powerful player in the Americas and an emerging threat to Spain's hegemony. Territories settled by British subjects were not directly challenged by Spain, though they were perceived as more than a nuisance. Jamaica and Barbados in the Caribbean, but also the seaboard colonies in North America, were growing in wealth and population and expanding territorially. So here are just a few examples of how Britain disrupted Spain's dominance in the decades before the Revolution. First, there was the British penetration of Spanish America, beginning, of course, with the conquest of Jamaica, which led to the destruction of colonial monopoly. Contraband was rampant, which meant that Spanish-American markets were not monopolized only for Spain and Spanish-American merchants. Britain gained the so-called asiento, which was the exclusive right to import slaves into Spanish America. In short, in the first half of the 18th century, we see a steady prying open of the Spanish Empire for British commerce. Britain was also growing in strength beyond the Atlantic world, challenging Spain's dominance in the Mediterranean. In addition to Gibraltar, the island of Minorca was under British rule for most of the 18th century. These were not minor conflicts, skirmishes on land and at sea over inconsequential places. Several of the 18th century wars involved massive casualties. Britain's invasion of Cartagena in modern Colombia, for example, resulted in the loss of 20,000 men, most from disease, especially yellow fever and malaria. Yet still, in spite of those losses, Britain kept coming. The 7 Years' War, as Gonzalo has said, which ended in 1763, was the major moment that helps us understand why Spain and France ultimately intervened in the American Revolution. Of course, the North American aspect of this conflict, known as the French and Indian War, disguises the fact and distracts from the fact that it was truly a global war in which the Americas were only one theater. Spain had entered the war belatedly in 1762. Word of its entry leaked, which permitted Britain to sack and occupy Havana in Cuba and Manila in the Philippines, which gives you, I think, just in and of itself, a sense of the global threat that Britain posed to Spain's empire from the Caribbean to the Far East. Britain ultimately returned Havana and Manila to Spain at the Peace of Paris in 1763, but Spain realized that the British threat was far from fleeting. Spain feared that Britain would continue to stretch westward across North America and to penetrate its South American markets as well. Something clearly needed to be done, and I will soon get to what Spain did, but first a word about the peace settlement. Britain walked away from the 7 Years' War with a new colony, West Florida, with Pensacola as its capital, as well as East Florida. From there, Britain could surveil shipping from Cuba and Puerto Rico, as well as New Orleans, which had been given to Spain as compensation and a consolation by its ally, France. The question for Spain was, would the annual treasure fleet for Mexico, then known as New Spain, of course, be imperiled? Would it be captured? This was not an idle worry. Rather, it was an existential threat. 20% of the revenues received by the Spanish crown came in the form of New World silver. Without fresh injections of precious metals from the New World, Spain's finances would be in tatters, with the potential of bankruptcy looming. And then what would happen to its empire? So the stakes of protecting the silver fleet could not have been higher. This almost 2-decade-long period, 1763 to 1779, when Spain formally entered the American Revolutionary conflict, was a period of significant and largely successful reform in Spain and its empire. And my dear colleague, Professor Lucena Giraldo, will delve more deeply into this extensive reform in his talk. Truth be told, much of what I know has been shaped by his scholarship, and so I'm kind of his warm-up act, as it were. I will note here that Spain played catch-up and bolstered its empire after 1763, and these reforms included an extensive program of naval reconstruction, major building and rebuilding of fortifications, experimentation with forms of free trade to foment commerce, and administrative modernization. I have suggested that Spain spent heavily on defense, and there's an apocryphal tale that Charles III, Spain's monarch from 1759 to 1788, when using a new powerful telescope in Madrid, asked humorously why he could not see the new fortifications protecting Havana's harbor, given how much royal treasure had been expended on their construction. And so, a little closer now to those new fortifications. In important ways, this program of reform was a major success. By the early 1770s, it was bearing fruit. Spain took advantage of almost 15 years of peace after 1763 to get its house in order, realizing that the competition for empire in the Americas, as well as for primacy in Europe, made conflict with Britain inevitable. The question was when it would come and how prepared would Spain be for it. When open conflict with Britain came, and it would come, Spanish statesmen were certain Spain would seek 3 short-term objectives and 3 longer-term ones. And Dr. Quintero has already described what a few of those are, but I think it's useful to recapitulate. The first, of course, was the recovery of Gibraltar. The second was the elimination of the British threat in the Mediterranean, especially their expulsion from Minorca. And also, to the extent possible, there was a desire to rid the Gulf Coast and the Gulf of Mexico of the British Navy to protect trade routes, especially silver conveyance. In the longer term, there is an effort to counteract the westward push of Anglo-American settlers into territories claimed by Spain. There was also a desire to stop British incursions into Central America, and the possibility of actually the creation of a canal using Lake Nicaragua to connect the Caribbean and the Atlantic to the Pacific. And finally, forestalling British dominance in the Pacific, as it would disrupt the Manila Galleon, which connected Mexico to the markets of the Far East. There were various moments in the 1770s where war almost broke out, especially over the Falkland Islands in 1774, which had been seized by Britain. But Spain remained patient, biding its time. The mechanism for achieving these 6 objectives, both short-term and long-term, was the Franco-Spanish alliance, which was renewed after the defeat in the 7 Years' War. And this alliance is known as the Family Compact because the Bourbon dynasty reigned on the thrones of both France and Spain. And the 2 empires had signed treaties of mutual support and aid in the event of war against Britain from the 2nd decade of the 18th century. And as I had mentioned, and as Dr. Quintero mentioned as well, Spain was understandably displeased with the result of the 7 Years' War. It was wary of further collaboration with perfidious or at least unreliable France, and nevertheless it did not wish to break its alliance, which proved indispensable in Europe, even if it exposed Spain to risks in the world beyond Europe's shores. I will not elaborate on France's reasons for joining the conflict we now know as the American Revolution. I will only sort of allude to motivation for revenge and also weakening Britain and its access to the New World resources, which France had been deprived of in the 7 Years' War. France realized, as Dr. Quintero said, that it could not go it alone and take on Britain without European allies, and specifically France needed Spain. And of course, this was obviously a very, very important intervention for the reasons that have already been shared and will be discussed at greater length tomorrow. But I want to turn to sort of the direct Spanish involvement in the American Revolution, focusing on the geopolitical dimensions. Spain was not easily persuaded to join in France's war effort. If anything, Spain savored France's desperation, which prefigured the extraction of a price for activating the alliance, as much as it relished the prospect of humbling Britain. Spain initially offered to mediate the conflict, and Britain initially embraced this idea, knowing that Spanish neutrality assured the numerical superiority of Britain's ships, and this would, barring unforeseen catastrophe, logically point to British victory. While Spain's offer of mediation was contemplated, France and Spain concluded the treaty that committed Spain to the war. This treaty recognized and accepted Spain's war aims, something unbeknownst to France's allies, the rebellious colonists. And distilled to its essence, by the Treaty of Aranjuez, France pledged not to make peace without Spain's consent and to continue the war until Gibraltar and Minorca were recaptured and returned to Spain. As historian Richard Morris observed long ago, France had in effect modified her alliance with America and changed and enlarged the purposes of the war without America's consent and even without her knowledge. The Treaty of Aranjuez was the closest Spain came to an alliance with the American colonists, and in effect, Spain committed itself to a treaty with France in support of its alliance with the revolutionaries against Britain, but not to an alliance with the rebels themselves. Nevertheless, this is very, very important. This intervention was very important. As historian Jonathan Dole concludes, although the Spanish Navy captured not a single British ship of the line, it was nevertheless vital to the American war effort. And the truth of this statement can be seen in the 1779 joint Franco-Spanish invasion, or attempted invasion of Britain, another armada of sorts. It diverted British naval resources from the American theater. It forced Britain to fight on multiple fronts, as opposed to concentrating its forces on suppressing its rebellious New World subjects. It's worth emphasizing that nothing was inevitable about Spain's involvement. British leaders were sure that Spain did not want to involve itself in the war, and they were right. Spain would have exited the war in exchange for Gibraltar. Britain's George III easily grasped this and was willing to make this cession, as were many of his key allies, both in Parliament and in his cabinet. They thought that swapping Gibraltar for Puerto Rico would be a fair trade. But British public opinion was dead set against sacrificing Gibraltar, and even the British cabinet unity broke down in response to public outrage. So you might say that British public opinion on Gibraltar imperiled the retention of the 13 colonies. The short-sightedness of this approach has been noted by many historians. There would be several negotiations between Spain and Britain during the war, but Gibraltar was the major sticking point. So if Spain had, If Spain had entered the war to regain Gibraltar, had the war been a lost cause? Having failed to gain this chief objective, I think, should not distract from what was gained by Spain. Britain was pushed out of what is now the southeastern part of our country. Both Floridas were recovered. Britain held on to its Caribbean colonies, but without an adjoining mainland, Spanish shipping was safer than it had been for a century, and the treasure fleet was safer than perhaps it had been for 2 centuries. This was especially true given the fractious nature of the newly independent United States. Furthermore, the likelihood of a British invasion of Spanish America decreased significantly, at least for a time. If anything, Spain appeared poised for expansion in North America, to make good on its claims in the American Southwest. New presidios were established in Northern California, including San Francisco in the late 1770s. Where Spain and Britain clashed in North America thereafter was in the very far north and west, far from the most prosperous Spanish-American viceroyalties, particularly Nootka Sound in modern-day British Columbia. In the Mediterranean, as I have mentioned, Minorca's recapture meant that Spain was again a dominant, if not the dominant force in that important sea. The French alliance had never been better. Several generations of statesmen on both sides of the Pyrenees had planned and plotted for an Anglo-Bourbon war. It appeared that their work was paying off. The 1780s were perhaps the high point of the Spanish Empire. We tend to think in terms of trajectories of rise, decline, and fall, but one should never rule out revival in thinking about empires. Spain's empire, in decline from the late 17th century, was revivified. The mid-1780s were a period of economic growth, peace, and optimism. The outbreak of the French Revolution would turn this geopolitical dream into a nightmare, for reasons that are beyond the scope of my remarks today. It would result in Napoleon's famous giveaway, the Louisiana Purchase, and of course, in 1808, Napoleon's occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, which lasted until 1813, rendered asunder what remained of the Franco-Spanish alliance. But all of that lay in the distant future. In the short term, the impact of the American Revolution was not only that it tipped the geopolitical scales in favor of the Bourbon dynasties, it drove home to Spanish policymakers that colonies might rise up against the mother country and separate themselves from it. In fact, they believed that they were acting just in time to avoid the same fate that had befallen Britain. In the 1780s, numerous rebellions broke out in the Spanish Empire, notably in what is now Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, over just the same sorts of things, taxes, too many of them, and representation, not enough, that proved harbingers of our revolution in this country. Once the United States was established, its example and the revolution that had birthed it attracted great interest in Spanish America. One writer in Bogota, now Colombia, in 1793 said, disapprovingly, "Since the establishment of the Anglo-American provinces as a free republic, the peoples of America have taken on a character which is entirely different from that which they had had. The common coin of erudite discussion groups in Spanish America is to discuss and even form plans around the means of enjoying the same independence that they enjoy." An interesting yet important footnote, however, is that it was less the federal Constitution of 1787, and let alone the Bill of Rights that was discussed in Spanish America, as well as in Portuguese America, than the state constitutions and even the Articles of Confederation. So we must always be aware that the US example was never monolithic and often served to inspire in unexpected ways. I now would just like to say a few things about US-Spain relations. And the relationship between Spain and what soon became the United States was never straightforward. It was initially cordial, but for how long could a republic and an empire remain neighbors without conflict? And when revolution broke out in the aftermath of the Napoleonic occupation of the Iberian Peninsula in Spanish America after 1810, the response to the United States was mixed. After 1815, popular opinion in the United States embraced the revolutionaries who sought to establish republics in place of an empire governed by the Spanish crown. US merchants sold arms and ammunition. Thousands of Americans sailed as mercenaries and privateers to fight against Spain. Some imagined an entire hemisphere composed of what they called sister republics. And by 1830, over 200 American babies had been named for the South American liberator Simón Bolívar, along with numerous towns and hamlets. The US government was more cautious, I should add. It did not want to embroil the United States in another war so soon after the War of 1812 had concluded. To this end, Congress passed the 1817 Neutrality Act to stem the flow of arms. The United States government also wanted to keep commerce flowing between Cuba and these shores, and also was involved in delicate negotiations with the Spanish government to acquire Florida, which occurred, of course, several years later. That's where I'd like to end my story this late afternoon. And much of the 19th century would, of course, see rising tensions between Spain and the United States over Cuba in particular, but also over Puerto Rico. Spain gradually became demonized, far from Jefferson's appreciation of Spanish culture that I quoted before. Spain became the US's foil, the very opposite of a democratic, enterprising United States. In 1898, of course, war broke out between Spain and the US, which led to the annexation of Puerto Rico and, for a time, Cuba. You'll hear more about the subject from the leading authorities, Professor Jacek and Kagan, tomorrow. So I conclude this afternoon with an observation about the development of the US-Spain relationship when viewed prospectively as opposed to retrospectively. In retrospect, the sources of tension and potential conflict are readily apparent. But I wish to observe how different things looked in 1779, 1780, 1781, and 1782, when Spanish-American troops helped to expel Britain from North American soil in the Gulf Coast, when Mexican silver via Cuba paid Washington's long-struggling troops, and when Spain's entry into the war catalyzed the Franco-American alliance, which made possible a victory that, as late as 1778, seemed improbable. Thank you very much.
Professor Manuel Lucena Giraldo will give today's last lecture, The Spanish Empire in the Long 18th Century.
Her Majesty, Senora authorities, ladies and gentlemen, anachronism, assimilation of present-day values to the past, and exceptionalism, presumption of a unique destiny, are very difficult matters for history, connected in any case to a humanist tradition. Conversation with the past, a privilege and a pain for historians, represents always a compromise and a renunciation. Although the history toolbox provides us some instruments, preconditions, evolution, even the very idea of progress for a soft landing in the past, to deal with what was undetermined, unexpected, or entitled as miraculous. As the foundation of the American Republic was, indeed, for brilliant Spanish ministers, such as the famous and much quoted this afternoon, the Count of Aranda, a member of the political elite in charge of the global Spanish monarchy, and a specialist in the newborn U.S. affairs after 1783 and before. Historiography of the 13 colonies until the American Revolution of Independence tends, in any case, to overstate the importance of North America in the Caribbean-centered English Empire. And here we have, not only in the case, of course, of the English Empire, but the European empires as a whole, with this map coming from Pedro Martir de Angleria. And we can imagine, of course, how the first islands, the Antilles, even the south of Florida, is more or less there. But we have this difficult match between the historiography of the events after the American independence and the image of the European empires in the New World. In the case of the Spanish Empire historiography, of course, Aranda's announcement, not in one but in multiple texts of the future power of United States, and I quote, "It will come the day it will be a giant, a terrible colossus comes as an ex post after the events argument, typical in a generation of ministers with, that is very important, direct political experience of administration, in many cases overseas. They took part not only in the affairs of the court in Madrid, but helped to produce a new, updated structure of the Spanish monarchical state, dealing with taxation, war, new laws, and institutions. Very much in display in this map, in these frescoes of the Royal Palace as seen, as painted by Tiepolo throughout the 1760s, with a very different nature of power, not by delegation or outsourcing of power, but with a new political branding. They represent, and I quote, how they introduce themselves in some cases, in Spain, of course, and in the Americas or in the Philippines, as Spaniards of the King, people of the new Bourbon monarchy, mixing tradition and innovation. On the contrary, the Spanish Habsburg Empire from 1519 to 1700s had been organized as a compact or composite monarchy made of fragments at different levels, with checks and balances between kingdoms and provinces, cities and urban republics, nobilities of different ethnic and geographical origins, Native Americans or African blacks included, guilds and corporations with liberties and privileges. I think this map of the Spanish Empire coming from the 1760s as the Immaculate Conception is a very good combination of tradition and innovation. You can see the head of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin is the Iberian Peninsula, and then the arms of the Virgin are South America, North America, and then the Philippines, where the image was produced by Vicente Memije, is concluding the image, which is geographical and symbolic at the same time. All, of course, was unified in this compact monarchy by the recognition of the monarch, always at the top. There was an incredibly complex, soft power Baroque system of symbols, celebrations, and negotiations happening in real time, in centers and peripheries in the 4 continents. Here, of course, we have, coming from 1572 by George Brown, a present for Philip II, celebrating at the same time, as said, tradition and innovation, geography and genealogy. Or this other image of Panama celebrating the new King Ferdinand VI in 1748 in the Plaza Mayor, in the main square, and representing, of course, a very Baroque city. Each color, a corporation, a group, a cofradia, and, of course, all integrating the present of the city, making the honor of the new king. It was going to be completely different in the Bourbon era, which would be characterized by a transition to a unified Spanish nation-state in both Atlantic hemispheres, European and American, as proclaimed in the Cádiz Liberal Constitution in 1812. Of course, we think in the Spanish empire and monarchy, we have to think about how political and symbolic communities cannot have an evolution from something structured in the past and producing something new in the future. It is very different. Spain, at the end of the Middle Ages, a peninsula with 2 kingdoms, turned into a unified structure with Isabel of Castile and Fernando of Aragon. And then what happened? Then it came the Renaissance Empire, a very European one, of Charles V, and then the universal monarchy of his son Philip II, the architect of the first globalization, with territories everywhere. And then the 3 different Catholic monarchies of the 17th century, Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II, and the end of the Habsburg dynasty in the government of Spain. It was, during a very long period, a very remarkable exercise in flexibility and invention of modern politics. Contrary to what the Black Legend or obsession with the Spanish decadence argue, recent global historiography show it was a case of political resilience. Revisionist arguments explain the history of the Spanish Empire throughout the longue durée of the 18th century, a unique and prolonged old regime, encompassing from the first Bourbon king, Philip V, arriving to power from France in the 1700s until 1810, a century of 110 years, exactly the 19th of April, here in this image, at dawn, when the first successful autonomous Spanish-American government was established in Caracas, in Venezuela, and the Captain General Vicente de Emparan was deposed by the coup d'etat of the Creole nobility of Mantuanos, the masters of the valleys. We know very well the Spanish-American process of independence began, and it took 15 years to conclude, double than in the US, with some exceptions. Global explanations are needed. If the Spanish Empire in that long 18th century of 110 years survived from California to Chile, from Barcelona to Manila, decadence, moral crisis, and final breakdown, as historiographical tradition established, caused either by the mere passing of time or by malfunctioning of corrupt elements or by divine intervention are just part of the picture. Resilience tends to be very complex. After 1763, with the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, whatever you prefer, colonial reforms were implemented more or less at the same time in the British, French, Portuguese, and Spanish empires in the Americas, winners or losers of the war. It is not possible to separate regional or global interactions and effects. We know in the 1760s the so-called Grenville program of colonial reforms, taxation, and militarization of British America determined preconditions of the American Revolution and, in due course, the US independence. Colonial reforms produced, as John Eliot pointed out, fragmentation and a new, very different Second British Empire. In the case of France, a classic explanation relates the new imperial era of debt with the Chuseol period, the state crisis, and maybe it's a matter of more discussion, the revolution after 1789. But what happened with the Spanish Empire? Classic explanations, if we go to the exact moment, 1779, when Spain joined the French Bourbons in the War of the American Revolution, the classic explanations about the application of colonial reforms turned into foundational myths of Spanish-American republics in the 19th century and established, like it was the case in the United States, a cause and effect reaction. Colonial reforms are connected to independence. Of course, it is clear in the US case. But what happened in the Spanish America? Why the Spanish Empire had a unified and prolonged time of reforms, at least until the 1780s, and in the end, the cause which began the fragmentation of the Spanish monarchy was the French Napoleonic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. There are a lot of noise in the general arguments of connection of colonial reforms and independence in the Americas. In the case of Spanish America, we know for sure the reforms were introduced after 1764, the last lost war against the British. And of course, despotism, unfair taxation, and centralization of authority and economy, new viceroyalties were, in the interpretation coming from the 19th century, connected to independence. But on the contrary, we know for sure after the last 30 years of historiography, after 1783, the Treaty of Paris and the US independence, we know the colonial reforms in Spanish America changed and were even stopped. And a new technocratic colonial pact replaced the old reformist anti-Creole model. The Spanish Empire began its dissolution in 1810 from the center in Europe, not from the American peripheries. And I would argue the example of a huge political event, the US independence in 1783, had a very, very strong influence for the victory in the court in Madrid of the moderate ministers over the radicals in the 1780s after the US independence. And of course, the toxic battle about the nature and implementation of the reforms in Spanish America were lost by the radicals. To put it other way, one of the unexpected effects of the American Rebellion was the return to old, more Habsburg, soft power constitution in order to preserve, as it happened, the Spanish Empire. It worked well, at least until 1795, when changes in the selection of the imperial elite and the arrival of a new generation changed the rules of the game. Last but not least, of course, the French and the Haitian Revolution were happening at that time. Some of the key reforms introduced in Spanish America after 1763 were the result of changes put into practice before in European Spain, la España Europea. Maybe this image of Madrid, you can recognize, of course, the Museum of the Prado, planned as an Academy of Sciences next to the Royal Botanical Garden and other institutions, was a very interesting expression of this new approach to making politics in a modern era. The Spanish monarchy was going to have a proper European capital, which of course is Madrid, which after Charles III, the best mayor Madrid never had, as the popular idea is repeating all the time. Of course, with the arrival of the Bourbons, the famous new establishment or Nueva Planta decree suppressing the local laws, jurisdictions, and institutions from the territories of the Crown of Aragon, Valencia, Mallorca, and Catalonia were implemented. It was their purpose, on the one hand, to create a body of common Spanish laws, and on the other, to establish a whole new organization of the audiencias, the high tribunals, and the councils. The royal officer representing this new system of unified peninsular government was the intendant. The first one was appointed in 1711, and by 1749, each peninsular province of the old compact monarchy was left behind, was related to an intendancy. But these measures were not implemented at the same time and everywhere in Spanish America. Although there was a reorganization to suppress some of the powers of the Council of the Indies, founded in 1754 in favor of the new Secretaries of State, there was an atmosphere of prudence towards the introduction of reforms on this side of the Atlantic. As the Marquis of Piedrasalbas pointed out in 1768, the alteration of a reliable and safe method of government in Spanish America had to be debated, because, I quote, "the experience has shown that every novelty is received there in the kingdoms of the Indies with violence. The remedies convenient to the head, Spain, do not always benefit the other parts of the body, the Indies. Difference in the reforms between British and Spanish began with timing in any case. In Spanish America, the colonial reforms began in 1750 with the signature between Spain and Portugal of the Treaty of Madrid. Here you have the map of the court to establish boundaries and control of the territories in South America. The introduction of intendancies in Spanish America was a reaction to the defeat in the 7 Years' War against the British, and of course the occupation of 1762 of Manila and Havana. But the reforms in Spanish America were put into practice 15 years before the war. Time was, in any case, by the 1760s, almost over, and ministers presumed in Madrid disorders were coming on both sides of the Spanish Atlantic. New questions are arising. Are there similarities between the popular Schillace mutiny by the name of the Sicilian reformist minister who introduced taxes and new rules in customs in Madrid in 1766, and revolutions against colonial reforms set by Gabriel Paquette in Peru, or what is now Colombia, between 1779 and 1781? Are there elements in common between the years of discontent here in the 13 colonies in North America in the 1760s, and what happened in other overseas regions of the Spanish Empire? Are there a Boston Tea Party in Madrid before or after what was happening here in what is now United States or in the Andes? What is happening with emulation or copying the system on the narrative of revolution in politics? If a new chronology of reforms in Spanish America can be established, the events and political writings from the 1740s must be considered. In 1741, for example, José del Campillo y Cosío, an experienced officer who served the intendancies of the Navy, Italy, and Aragon, was appointed Secretary of the War, Navy, and the Indies. He wrote in 1742 one of the most influential books of the century in Spain and Spanish America, even if it circulated only in manuscript until 1789, when it was published to collect some money for his neglected widow. The new system of economic governance for America, with an important subtitle not so usually mentioned, with the evils and pains caused by the system there are today, influencing Spain harshly, and universal remedies for the advantages from Spain and the bigger interests of the Americas, considered the Spanish were suffering the decadence of the Americas trade. Campillo called for the construction of roads and canals, the increase of population, and free trade in its own terms, that is, in the same monarchy. In his Magna Opera, he identified some policies for European peasants that could be implemented easily, he imagined, in the native communities of the New World. His other works had titles fixing a reformist position and the spirit of new measures, was somewhat connected to this idea of a new imperial nation-state building. Spain Wake Up, España Despierta, and an amazing dictionary of Spanish pros and cons, entitled What is for More and for Less in Spain, for Spain to be what must be and not what currently is. Campillo died in 1743, but the emerging figures of the period, Marquis of Ensenada and José de Carvajal, Minister of State and Foreign Affairs, sustained much of the reformist program sketched in the previous years, not only for Spain, but also for the New World. Of course, in 1749, it's very important to take into account they organized a direct collection of taxes, the single contribution, and a proper register of property. Of course, the Treaty of Madrid must be seen as the main example of how the colonial reforms were changing the very nature of the administration of the Spanish monarchy in the Americas. The key element, of course, was for the very first time there would be a permanent presence of the authority of the crown in the American frontiers. And after 1763, with the defeat of Spain in the 7 Years' War, nothing came as a surprise. This long reformist tradition, already in motion, simply exploded, giving shape to new measures explained and related to the urgencies of the moment. But nobody could prevail. The peak of the reforms in Spanish America would coincide with the war of what we know as the War of American Independence. On the 24th of September 1781, the first intendant of Venezuela, José de Ábalos, a very experienced bureaucrat from La Mancha who served in Cuba, sent a text to the King Charles III of Spain and the Indies. No doubt he was affected by the contemporary Tupac Amaru indigenous revolt in Peru and other similar revolutions happening in what is now Venezuela and Colombia. And what was the main idea of Ábalos? He proposed to the King Charles III a prudent, and I quote, a quick division of much of these provinces, erecting in them particular monarchies divided among the glorious branches of the Augustan family of His Majesty. Hardly 2 years after this proposal, not the powerful Count of Aranda, as José Antonio Escudero established in 2014, but somebody connected to imperial affairs wrote a secret judgment on the consequences of the independence of the United States for the Spanish monarchy, and especially for the viceroyalty of New Spain, Mexico. This author was deeply worried about the declining opportunities for the Spanish-American Creoles in an updated and reformed Spanish Atlantic monarchy, and of course was advising the king what to do in order to avoid what happened in the British Empire before 1783. So there are some very interesting ideas and proposals and regulations about the integration of the Spanish-American Creoles in the imperial government. But the main argument was similar to that of Avalos. In the same mood of the debate on the federalization of the Spanish monarchy to adapt the constitution and political structures to the new and menacing times, the author proposed Charles III, and I quote, to get rid of all the possessions of the continent of Americas, retaining just the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the north and some others of interest in the south, just to serve as a stop for the Spanish trade. 3 infants would be appointed kings of Mexico, Peru, and Tierra Firme, taking His Majesty the title of emperor. More or less, it was to go back to the beginning of the 16th century. In any case, Aranda was, you remember very well, the representative of Spain in the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And after many humiliations from the British, he was more than happy to celebrate the victory of Spain and France at their much-desired revenge on Britain after what would become known as the War of American Independence. But even at that moment of victory and glory, he was worried about the survival of the Spanish monarchy under much international pressure. The key element was to avoid what has just happened in the US and not to have the same mistakes that the British did in the Americas. Avalos, in his report, reacted against a situation which reminded him the decadence of empires, as taught by the experience of Greece and Rome. And so he proposed a wise measure, so he believed, the separation of the dynasties in Europe and in the Americas, as said. The objective, in the end, was to delay the end of the Spanish Empire as much as possible. That was the big lesson the Spanish ministers learned from the experience of patriotism and liberty put into practice by the American colonists in North America after 1776. To resist is to win. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we close, we will just take a question for each professor. If you will care to join me. There are a number of questions, but we'll just take one. To Gonzalo Quintero. Where's Gonzalo? Or maybe we'll start with a question for Professor Paquette. Professor Paquette, someone in the audience wants to know, why were the British so committed to keeping Gibraltar?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the question. There are a number of different reasons why.
why Gibraltar was considered so crucial to the maintenance of British imperial designs. The first was really the control over the Mediterranean, which was surprisingly still for them a very important theater. The second was, of course, thinking forward to the Asian empire that they were beginning to establish and thinking about terrestrial routes actually from the Eastern Mediterranean to South Asia. So there are a number of reasons why Gibraltar was considered so crucial to their designs. But again, as I mentioned, it wasn't deemed absolutely indispensable to George III. And we're supposed to not engage in counterfactuals, but had George III's vision of the importance of Gibraltar been taken seriously, one could imagine a very different result to the American Revolution.
Mr. Quintero, was religion part of the reason why Spain and France, both Catholic, fought together against England, Protestant? One member of the audience would like to know. You don't hear. Let me repeat this. A member of the audience would like to know if religion was part of the reason why Spain and France, both Catholic, fought together against England, Protestant.
Short answer, no. It was a struggle of power, just power. They were all fighting for power. They all had their own religion. And actually, the United States had no religion, had several of those. So it played no part in this. Of course, there were misgivings between certain troops that were fighting together. For example, there were problems between the French and the US troops in certain stages because of the different customs, the different way they conduct themselves, and because of the different religions. But there were also problems between the French and the Spanish troops when they were stationed together in Haiti, waiting to invade Jamaica, and they were both Catholics. It's just a question of national interest. It's always national interest and nothing more than that.
Professor Lucena, one member of the audience would like to know, does New Spain include Central and South America or just Mexico and the US West?
Okay.
New Spain.
Yes. Well, the Viceroyalty of New Spain was from what is now the west of the United States to the General Captaincy of Guatemala. Maybe you know very well the map, and you have the best maps, Gonzalo. What's the limit? The limit of the Viceroyalty of New Spain was in...
The Viceroy of Spain was, in theory, the whole possessions in the United States that were called the Provincias Internas, but they were dependent from the Viceroyalty of New Spain. It was today Mexico, but also all Central America until Panama. Panama belonged to the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, which is now Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama. So just to Panama from the whole United States. It was one of the biggest viceroyalties at the time. At the time, there were 4 viceroyalties: Mexico, New Spain, Nueva Granada, Great Colombia and surrounding countries, Peru, which is Peru, Chile, and parts of Ecuador and Bolivia, and Rio de la Plata, which is Argentina and part of other countries.
Okay, so thank you very, very much. Thank you to all participants who have shared their expertise tonight, showing us, as one historian remarked, that history is not the past, but a map of the past, drawn to be useful to the modern traveler. Thank you, Your Majesty, once more for your presence during this first day of the second American Spain 250 Initiative Symposium. Thank you all for attending. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at this same magnificent Constitution Hall at 10 o'clock. Thank you all. Good night.